It was just after 3 p.m. when chaos erupted across the street. A frantic man pounded on a neighbor's door, cradling a lifeless little girl in his arms. Her tiny body hung limp, cold, battered, unrecognizable. His voice trembled as he gasped into the 911 call. "She's not breathing. Please, help!" You can almost hear the sheer panic, the desperation cutting through the air as he begged for someone, anyone, to save her. But when officers arrived, what they saw wasn't just the gut-wrenching sight of a man pretending to be a hero. No, it was something far worse. The girl's body told a story, one of unspeakable horror. Bruises in places no child should have bruises. Skin missing from areas that made no sense. Even seasoned officers, hardened by years of brutality, had to look away. And the worst part? The man wailing for help was the very monster who had done this to her. This is the story of Koralynn Marie Fister, a 2-year-old girl whose bright eyes and endless curiosity were stolen before she even had a chance to understand the world. Her life ended inside that house on West Oakview Street. But how did it come to this? What really happened behind those closed doors? This case is more than just a crime. It's a tangled mess of manipulation, deception, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones we should fear. The investigation, the courtroom battle, the lies. They're all about to unravel before your eyes. Step by step, we'll piece together the truth, no matter how painful it is to hear. Before we dive in, a huge shout out to my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and comments fuel these stories and help shed light on the darkness. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime fanatics. Now let's get into it. Koralynn, better known to those who loved her as Monkey, was a firecracker of a kid. Always climbing, exploring, pushing boundaries like a tiny daredevil on a sugar rush. Her giggle was infectious, her grin mischievous, and her love for dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets legendary. She was the kind of kid who could turn a bad day around with just one laugh. But here's the thing about stories like these. They always start with innocence before taking a devastating turn. Koralynn was just beginning to discover the world, just starting to carve out her little space in it. And then, just like that, it was taken from her. Picture this, a warm afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, Koralynn in the backyard, climbing anything and everything, her mother, Becky, watching with a mix of pride and amusement. "Careful, little monkey, don't fall," Becky would call out. And Koralynn? She'd just laugh and keep climbing, fearless as ever. But life wasn't always sunshine and backyard adventures. Behind closed doors, things were unraveling. Her parents, Becky and David, had once been hopeful, a young couple convinced they could build a life together. David had even moved across states to be with Becky. It should have been the start of something beautiful. Instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare.
David worked long hours, grinding away to keep things afloat. Becky stayed home, juggling the chaos of 2 little ones, Koralynn and her older sister, just trying to keep life from falling apart. For a while, they made it work, but life, as it often does, had other plans. August 2011 hit like a wrecking ball. David lost his job. Stress mounted, bills stacked up like a bad game of Jenga. By February 2012, their relationship crumbled. They called it quits. They agreed to share custody. David had Koralynn on Wednesdays and Thursdays, while Becky had her the rest of the week. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. At first, co-parenting seemed manageable. But let's be honest, breakups rarely stay clean. Becky started pulling away. David, he wasn't just some ex, he was a dad who wanted to be there, to watch Koralynn grow, to hear her laugh, to be a part of her life. But soon, Becky stopped answering his texts. The silence stretched. David's concern turned into something darker, an unsettling gut feeling that something was wrong. By April 2012, that feeling became unbearable. Weeks had passed without a word about his daughter, so he did what any desperate father would do. He showed up, knocked on the door, demanded to see Koralynn, but Becky stood firm. No, not today. Then from inside the house, Koralynn's cry, a tiny, desperate sound that cut through everything. Becky hesitated. Reluctantly, she let David take Koralynn for a short visit. Just a few hours, no big deal. Except this would be the last time David ever saw his little girl alive. He had no idea what she was about to endure. See, Becky wasn't alone in that house anymore. She had a new boyfriend, James Maurice Rear. Just another guy? Not quite, he had a past. A violent one. But David didn't know that. He thought his daughter was safe, that she was okay. He was wrong. The next time David saw Koralynn, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't climbing or giggling or calling him daddy. She was gone.
Looking back at Koralynn E's short life, it's impossible not to feel a storm of emotions. She was that little firecracker, climbing everything in sight, stuffing her face with chicken nuggets, and lighting up every room she walked into. But beneath that joy, she was caught in something far darker. A tug of war between a father who loved her and a mother who was slowly slipping under the influence of a man with a much darker agenda. Koralynn's story didn't have to end the way it did. It never should have. James Maurice Rear. On the surface, just another smooth talker with a charming smile. But James wasn't just some guy. He was a predator hiding in plain sight. And Becky Hoople, she never saw it coming. Fresh out of a broken relationship, drowning in stress, and raising 2 kids alone, Becky thought James was a lifeline. He cooked, he cleaned, he played the doting partner and made her feel like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. For a while, it felt like she'd finally caught a break. But that's the thing about manipulation. It never kicks down the door. It slips in through the cracks. James wasn't helping. He was infiltrating. Every favor came with invisible strings. Every decision he made chipped away at Becky's independence. Slowly, she leaned on him more and more until she couldn't tell where her choices ended and his control began. And that's exactly how he wanted it. At first, it was subtle. He took on more responsibilities, claimed he was just making things easier. He had kids of his own, so why not help with Becky's? But soon it wasn't help, it was control. He dictated the rules, decided how the kids were raised, and little by little, he cut Becky off from the outside world. And she let him. James had a past, a violent, twisted past. But Becky never saw the warning signs. His ex-girlfriends did, though. They had stories, horrific ones. Manipulation, isolation, accusations of cheating. And when words weren't enough, violence followed. One woman even claimed James had attacked her just after she'd given birth. But Becky never heard those stories. And if she had, she might have brushed them off. Because when you're desperate, when you need something to believe in, you ignore the monsters even when they're standing in your living room. And then the bruises started appearing. At first, Becky had excuses. Kids fall, right? They bump into things. It happens. But the marks kept coming. Koralynn started acting differently. She flinched. She hesitated. The light in her eyes dimmed. And deep down, Becky felt it. That gnawing, gut-wrenching feeling that something wasn't right. But denial is a powerful thing. If she admitted the truth, it meant she had let a monster into her home. And that was something she wasn't ready to face. By the time Becky realized what was happening, it was too late. James had taken control of everything that mattered, the parts of her life she couldn't afford to lose, and Koralynn, she was already trapped in his web. The real horror? It didn't happen all at once. It crept in, silent, invisible, until the day everything shattered.
It was just another day, ordinary, uneventful. Becky Hoople grabbed her things, stepped out at 12:30 p.m., and left her 2-year-old daughter, Koralynn, at home with her boyfriend, James. Just a quick errand. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to worry about. Except that day, May 24th, 2012, was the day everything changed. James was there, right? The helpful boyfriend, always stepping in, always playing the part of the reliable partner. Becky trusted him. So when he decided to give Koralynn a bath, there was no reason to think twice. And then things got strange. James said he stepped out, just for a minute, just long enough to grab a towel. That's the kind of thing people say when they don't want too many questions. The kind of excuse that makes you stop and wonder, why didn't he call 911 from inside his own house? Why rush to the neighbor's porch? Why start CPR there? Why beg them to call for help when he could have just picked up his own phone? Why the delay? What was he trying to control? Then the door opened, and the horror unfolded. Koralynn, limp and lifeless, was laid out on the porch. But this wasn't just a drowning. This wasn't some tragic accident. Her body told a different story, a horrific one: bruises, blunt force trauma to her head, burns, cuts, and then, the worst part, skin torn away, her tiny legs, her toes, deliberately mutilated. The paramedics took one look and knew. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't some freak accident. This was something much darker. And just like that, James's story unraveled the minute he claimed he left the room. A lie, the innocent act, an illusion, the concerned boyfriend, a monster hiding in plain sight. Because this wasn't an accident. This was the end of months of control, manipulation, and abuse. And now there was no hiding the truth anymore.
A little girl, helpless, broken, and left to die. But by the time emergency responders arrived, it was already too late. Not just too late to save her, but too late to believe a single word James had to say. Koralynn's body was cold. Not just cold, unnaturally cold. Long past the point where help could have made a difference. And yet James acted like he had just found her, as if there was still hope. But the truth was much darker. Koralynn had been dead for hours before he even pretended to care. Let that sink in. Hours. While he went about his day, while he covered his tracks, while he made up his story, Koralynn lay there lifeless. And when he finally made a move, instead of calling 911 from his own house like any normal person, he carried her over to the neighbor's porch and had them call for help. Why? Because calling from inside his own home would have been too risky. Too much evidence. Too many questions he didn't want to answer. And those injuries, they weren't from drowning, not even close. The paramedics knew it the second they saw her. Bruises, burns, cuts, even torn skin. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a case of neglect. This was monstrous. James had a story, sure, but it was unraveling fast. And the more investigators dug, the worse it got. Turns out this wasn't his first time hurting someone. Ex-girlfriends came forward, each with horror stories of their own. Control, manipulation, violence. One woman said he accused her of cheating, then choked her into submission. Another? He assaulted her just days after she had given birth. The pattern was clear. James wasn't just dangerous, he was a ticking time bomb. And then there was Becky, Koralynn's mother. At first, she was just another grieving parent, blindsided by tragedy. But as the facts started rolling in, so did the doubts. How did she not see the signs? How did she not know? Had James fooled her too? Or was she ignoring the truth because facing it was too painful? Some believed she was just another victim, emotionally trapped, manipulated beyond reason. Others weren't so sure, because whether she meant to or not, she had let a predator into her daughter's life. She had trusted a man who didn't deserve it, and now her little girl was gone. One thing was certain. James had spent years perfecting his act. He knew exactly how to control people, how to make them doubt reality. And Becky? Maybe she was just another one of his victims. Or maybe, just maybe, she was too blind to see the dangers staring her right in the face. Predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear the face of someone you trust. And by the time you see them for who they really are, it's already too late.
The courtroom was thick with tension. James Reeder sat motionless, his face a mask of indifference, as the prosecution laid out the horror of what he had done. Charge after charge was read aloud: homicide by abuse, rape, possession of meth. Each word painted a gruesome picture, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, fear, regret. Whatever it was, it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the same cold, calculated demeanor that had carried him this far. And then, the moment everyone had been waiting for, his plea. But James wasn't about to go down fighting. No dramatic denials, no righteous outbursts. Instead, he took the coward's exit, an Alford plea. For those unfamiliar, an Alford plea is a legal loophole where a defendant acknowledges there's enough evidence to convict them, but refuses to admit guilt. It's like saying, yeah, you got me, but I'm not saying I did it. Convenient, right? James knew the system had him cornered, but instead of facing his crimes, he chose to skirt around accountability. No remorse, no responsibility, just a strategic maneuver to avoid fully owning up to the nightmare he had inflicted. And that's what stung the most. A man who had stolen a child's life, shattered a mother's world, and left a trail of destruction in his wake, now had the luxury of not admitting to any of it. Then came the sentencing, the moment of truth, or at least what should have been. The judge's words landed like a gut punch: 37 and a half years, a sentence that meant James would one day have a chance to breathe free air again. But the kicker: no requirement to register as a sex offender. Let that sink in. A man who raped and murdered a child, legally exempt from a label that should follow him forever. How does that make sense? Where was the real justice in that? The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the weight of the verdict pressing down on everyone who had hoped for more. But James wasn't the only one on trial. Becky Hoople, Koralynn's mother, had her own reckoning to face. The charge? Criminal mistreatment. The punishment? 1 year and a single day in jail. A lot of people weren't happy about that. 1 year? That's less time than some people spend waiting for a medical diagnosis. A child had suffered for months, trapped in a nightmare no one saved her from, and her mother, the one person who should have protected her, was walking away with barely a slap on the wrist. Now, to be fair, some argued Becky wasn't fully aware of what was happening. Cognitive disabilities, emotional manipulation, maybe she truly didn't see the danger right in front of her. But does that excuse her from responsibility? Does that erase the fact that she let James, a man with a violent past, have access to her daughter time and time again? Some say she deserved more time behind bars. Others believe she was a victim too, just another pawn in James's twisted game. But the real question remains, was justice truly served? Because at the end of the day, Koralynn never got to grow up. She never got to escape. And the people responsible, one with decades in prison, the other with barely a year, will still get the chance to move on with their lives. But Koralynn never will, and that's a failure no courtroom can ever fix.
Justice is supposed to be black and white, good versus evil, right versus wrong. But what happens when it falls into a murky gray area? When someone isn't a monster in the traditional sense, but their choices still lead to tragedy? Becky wasn't some criminal mastermind, no elaborate schemes, no calculated evil. But she was complicit, and that made the verdict a tough pill to swallow. Some argued she deserved more time. After all, her inaction didn't just fail Koralynn, it cost the little girl her life. So what does justice even look like here? How do we reconcile the fact that James, who had a rap sheet dripping with violence, got a sentence that felt like a slap on the wrist, while Becky, the mother who failed to protect her daughter, barely saw the inside of a jail cell? If justice is about balance, this case was tipping over like a broken scale. Koralynn's life was stolen, and no courtroom ruling was going to change that. This wasn't just about what happened in front of a judge. It was about what should have happened long before she ever needed one. The community felt that loss in a way that words couldn't fully capture. On a quiet night in Washington Park, they gathered. Candles flickered against the darkness, a faint glow in a world that suddenly seemed dimmer. They stood there, mourning a little girl they never truly knew, but wished they had been able to save. The messages left behind were simple, heartfelt: love, grief, a deep sense that Koralynn wasn't just a victim. She was a reminder of a system that failed her. Her funeral, held on June 16, 2012, was small, private, painfully quiet. And as the town grieved, they weren't just mourning her. They were mourning the justice she never truly got. So now I want to hear from you. Should Becky be held accountable for her daughter's death? Or was she just another victim of James' manipulation? Was she complicit, or was she too trapped to see the danger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe these victims deserve a voice, hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps these stories from being forgotten. Don't forget to ring the bell, because together we make sure the truth doesn't get buried. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe.